Welcome to a special series called The Global Crisis Monitor, featured on the Treasury Update podcast. Thank you for joining. On this episode of the podcast, series host Meredith Zonsius catches up with Alexa Cook and Craig Jeffery of Strategic Treasure on the fifth week's results from the COVID-19 Impact and Response Survey. This new iteration of the micro-survey focuses on reopening the economy and lifting the lockdown from a health, medical, and economic standpoint. Listen in on this week's results from Treasury and finance professionals as we continue to monitor the situation. So 5 weeks worth of results are now in from the Global Crisis Monitor. What is the theme, and can you give me a few examples of the headlines?
We're still stormy with signs of daylight. There's less clouds, but it's still quite stormy, but there's more silver lining, particularly with organizational liquidity. This is the first week of 5 weeks where there was more positive alterations than negative. So 28% viewed it more positive versus 16.9% more negative about the change in the organizational liquidity over the last week. Also, there's not as many major negative headlines this week.
Yeah, so I can add a bit to that. We've added some new survey questions on the reopening of the economy and lifting the lockdown in the past week. And there's been some interesting results from both a health and medical viewpoint and an economic standpoint. Both were quite important to our respondents, but reopening based within a time frame had barely registered.
Perfect. So that represents a new set of questions. What are some of the details?
Sure. So opening up was a big issue and had a lot of controversy. 90% thought that the lockdown should be lifted based on the medical situation and how to handle those high-risk populations. 37% then felt that it should be based on economic concerns. There was definitely a lot of overlap between, those two different categories. And then there was a small percentage that felt that it should be just a standard time frame that should not be exceeded. And some of the top categories that respondents used to lift the lockdown or to classify those percentages I just mentioned were in the medical and health area. The number one was the broader testing for the virus and its antibodies, which was almost 80%. And then medication and treatment with a demonstrated success for survivability was about 60%, and then a week or more of ongoing declining cases brought in about 55%. Broad availability of PPE sat right at about 50%, and then vaccines were a much smaller percentage.
Very interesting. How should the lockdown be lifted?
Yeah, so building on the medical side to the economic side, economic concerns, we saw 52% of respondents of those who had selected economic concerns saying that it should include factors about unemployment. And so that translates to about 21% of the total. And about 1 in 9 respondents said to lift the lockdown, it should include information about GDP and considerations.
How would you summarize our learning about lifting the lockdown?
Our monitor showed that money matters mattered for many, but medical matters mattered more.
Let's get into some of the numbers from this week's monitor. How are people feeling about their organization's outlook on liquidity positions?
I would say, kind of recapping the headline, is never better in the history of this 5-week survey. And that's good. That's the first time it improved over the prior week. So it was negative, the prior week. This week was worse than the prior week. The next week was worse than that week, et cetera. But I would caution that doesn't mean we're out of the woods or that things are bright. It doesn't mean things are good. Simply our first week of seeing an improved outlook over the past week for organizational liquidity. 2 other top concerns of the forced ranking of 7 concerns that we have, and I encourage everyone to look at the report. The top concern was direct financial impact to the business. This took over the number 1 spot, closely followed by access to adequate liquidity, which has moved to one of the top positions and stayed there most of the duration of the survey. Both of them very much related to financing and access to liquidity.
That's insightful information. So let's talk recovery perceptions on both a health and economic level.
Okay, I can start there with the health. So that's been pretty static and consistent with last week. The inflection point and the movement to the point where COVID-19 has a minimal health impact essentially matched last week. Less than a month for the inflection point and about 5 months for the point where COVID-19 is a minimal health impact.
Yeah, the economic viewpoint there was pretty much static as well. So the return to normalcy still averages just under 9 months. But when we look at the two other time domains where we're asking about the economy, the 3-month and 12-month time domains, outlook improves slightly for both the 3-month and 12-month outlook.
So last week we discussed AP and AR again. Are some interesting changes there to report?
Yes. So last week we cycled the AP questions out of the survey in order to provide space for some of those reopening questions. But AR is still extremely negative, but not as hyper pessimistic as last week. This week AR showed 7 times more negative versus last week, which was like 10 plus times more negative.
I look forward to catching up with you both next week. Are there any things to watch out for?
Yeah, so we have some new questions coming up. I invite you to take the survey and see what they are, and then check in again to find the responses. But we're also going to be monitoring reopening activity. Is it as careful and calibrated as governors are requiring it to be and stating it, or is it too much, too early, and careless? Will that result in different types of outcomes and influence the overall economy? And then finally, some of the concerns about funding for small and medium-sized businesses. There were some delays in some different regions of the world, including the U.S. Some additional funding has been provided, but time to get it to those companies has obviously been extended more. We'll see how that works out and if that changes attitudes, perceptions, and ultimately unemployment numbers.
Thanks, Craig and Alexa, for sharing again this week. I'm looking forward to next week. We wanted to encourage you to take the Global Crisis Monitor survey repeatedly while it's live. It runs from Wednesday to Tuesday every week. You can go to treasurycoalition.com and follow the links. Add your voice and insight so that as a profession, we can take positive and knowledgeable steps to move our organizations and nations forward. Invest 5 minutes each week at treasurycoalition.com and get great information and insights while helping our profession and organizations.
This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.